Hey guys, welcome back, and this week we're going to talk about some of the best and worst games that I've ever received as gifts. So no, none of these are anything that was purchased with my own money, just games that I asked for or games that were randomly gifted to me by family members. Yes, that actually did happen to me. Now before you start thinking that I sound like a spoiled kid complaining about some of these free games, trust me, I appreciated any game that I got as a kid, good or bad. But over the years, I've certainly come to appreciate more than some of the others. And honestly, some just downright sucked, no matter how much I tried to like them. So let's get straight to some of these games with a classic NES game that needs no introduction. Castlevania for the NES was the very first game that I got for the console. My dad had promised us that he would get an NES when he got his tax check that year. And sure enough, one Sunday morning, he came home with an NES and 2 games to go along with it. Now we'll get to that second game in a minute, but the one that instantly got my attention was Castlevania. Running through a huge gothic castle, slapping undead monsters left and right with a whip, and learning just how hard an NES game can be, man, it was all there with Castlevania. You play as Simon Belmont as you make your way through Dracula's castle to find Dracula and make him regret ever resurrecting himself. This is classic NES here as you walk and jump your way through every level using only your whip and a variety of special weapons that you can pick up along the way. You'll need everything you can find too because Castlevania isn't easy. After the first couple of levels, you'll be dying constantly from cheap enemy placement, tough bosses, and some tricky platforming thanks to Simon having a jump that's somehow both heavy and floaty at the same time. Like I said, this is classic NES here, and I loved every minute of it. Of all the games that I eventually owned for the NES, Castlevania was the one that constantly stuck around and got played. While a lot of kids will never forget getting Mario Brothers or Duck Hunt with their NES, I feel like I got the better game when my dad grabbed Castlevania from a Toys R Us just because he thought a dude with a whip on the box was cool. Top Gun for the NES was the second game that I got when my dad brought that NES home. I think his line of reasoning was that he knew that I was a huge fan of Top Gun the movie at the time, so I guess he just figured that I'd like the game just as much. And my room was filled with models and toys of the F-14 Tomcat, which was the jet featured in the movie, so yeah, this was definitely up my alley. Now I'm sure you've all heard a ton about this one over the years, as it's made itself infamous for the absolutely insane landing sequences, which requires super precise timing to successfully land on the aircraft carrier. A lot of players just couldn't get past this one aspect of the game, making it ripe for retro gaming meme material over the years. Outside those landing sequences though, Top Gun isn't that bad of a game. It was definitely trying to go for a slower PC flight sim kind of thing, especially with its nicely detailed cockpit view, making you feel like you were sitting right inside an F-14. But by far the biggest sticking point here is Top Gun's super high difficulty level. After the first stage, the game gets hard, like really hard, kind of like impossibly hard at times. For as much as I played this one as a kid, I only beat it a handful of times, and I never felt like it was anything but luck when I did. Still, this is one that I've got a ton of nostalgia for. It's not something I really go back to these days, but I'll definitely still defend it if anyone starts complaining how hard it is to land the plane on the carrier. I mean, come on guys, it's not that hard. The rest of the game is, but landing it on the carrier isn't that hard. Ghostbusters on the NES was a completely random gift that should have been amazing, but it ended up being anything but. Like many kids at the time, my favorite movie from the 80s was Ghostbusters, and I would go crazy over just about anything that had the Ghostbusters logo slapped onto it. Cartoons, toys, cereal, you know how it goes. I was into some Ghostbusters back then. So you can imagine how I nearly lost my mind when a relative came over one random day and took this out of her purse and handed it to me like it was nothing. It wasn't even my birthday or Christmas or anything like that. Just a free game out of nowhere. I couldn't believe it. And even though the back of the box pictures didn't look too hot, this was still Ghostbusters on the NES. It had to be good. But I think you already know the end of this story. As excited as I was to get Ghostbusters that morning, it quickly turned into a mixture of confusion, disappointment, and just wondering how this could even be called Ghostbusters. Coupled with the excruciatingly bad gameplay sucked every bit of fun out of this one almost instantly. And trust me, I tried. I genuinely tried to wring any fun out of this game as a kid. But this game is just misery from start to finish. Nothing about it is fun at all. It's the definition of a bad game. And everything that's been said about this one over the years is actually accurate. I was sad then, and it still makes me sad now for how many other kids out there had their days ruined because of this game too. So yeah, stay far, far away from this one. There's no feeling good about any busting in this game. Jaws on the NES was a game that completely bewildered me when I opened it up on Christmas Day at my mom's house as a kid. I wasn't a fan of the movie, hell, I hadn't even seen the movie, and I just had no idea what you'd even do with a game based around a big shark that eats people. My immediate hope was that you could actually just play as Jaws, snacking on swimmers that get too close or something like that. Unfortunately, that idea is way better than what I actually got when I loaded this one onto my NES later that day. What you actually do in Jaws is sail around the ocean in your little boat until you hit something. This then changes the view into a side-scrolling underwater area where you can freely swim around and shoot your harpoon at the various sea life. Murder enough innocent sea creatures and they'll eventually drop conch shells that you need to use at seaports to level up your attack power. So you basically just go back and forth to each seaport until you get enough power to finally do enough damage to Jaws to defeat him. This is another one of those games that I hated as a kid, but I ended up playing way too much because it was one of the few games that I actually owned. Over the years, I've kind of come around to liking this one a little bit more than I did as a kid at least. It has an almost relaxing pace to it, and it doesn't hurt that you can play through the entirety of it in like 10 minutes if you know what you're doing. It's obvious that this game and the game coming up were plucked out of the Kmart clearance bin by my grandma because she just had no idea what to get, and these were probably very cheap at the time. And while I appreciated just about every game that I got back then, man, I had to work extra hard to get any fun out of Jaws. And if Jaws wasn't enough, Tiger-Helli for the NES was the second game that I unwrapped that morning. This is another game that I had never had on any list and had never even heard about before, but yet here it was, fresh out of that clearance bin and into my hands. I mentioned before that I've never been the biggest fan of shooters, and Tiger-Helli, upon closer inspection, was definitely a shooter. So this and Jaws was a 1-2 punch of disappointment that morning. This is one of those dead simple early arcade shooters too, where about the only thing you can do is move your helicopter around to shoot enemies coming at you and drop some bombs to clear the area if things get too hairy. You can occasionally pick up small satellite choppers to give you more firepower, but you do so at the expense of making yourself a much larger target. And since you're already a beefy boy and don't move very fast anyway, you probably won't be keeping those baby choppers around for very long. This one also gets pretty hard as you progress, of course, but thanks to the excruciatingly slow pace of the game, it can feel like it takes ages to get back to the areas that finally start to get challenging. This is also one of those NES games that just seems to flicker constantly. No matter what's happening, there's stuff flickering all over the place. So if you get headaches from stuff like that, definitely stay away from this one. But just like Jaws, I still ended up playing this one a good deal anyway. It's not a bad shooter at all, it's just really slow. I would have probably played this one a lot more if there were like codes or something to warp you to different sections of the game, since it just takes so damn long to get anywhere in this one. But if you want a classic NES shooter, I guess you could probably do worse than Tiger-Helli. It's just not my thing. NCAA Basketball for the Super NES is a game that, believe it or not, I actually asked for. Mainly because this was the first basketball game to use the Super NES scaling engine called Mode 7, with a really incredible looking behind the back view of the court, making this game look really neat in magazine previews. And I think that's just what got my attention. It really stood out from the standard court view that most basketball games had at the time, with the promise of the action feeling more like you were actually on the court rather than just being a bystander. And that alone was more than enough for this one to make it onto my Christmas list that year. And really, those cool Mode 7 graphics were probably the best thing that the game had going for it. Unfortunately, those neat graphics came at a cost, as the fast-paced action of basketball is all but gone, thanks to the camera slowly and awkwardly making its way around the court. I will say that the effect of being on the court is pretty good for a Super NES game, but beyond that, this is a very slow and basic game of b-ball. Besides the passing and shooting, there's not a ton of strategy here. You can call plays on the fly, but really there's not much else going on here. The only thing that really made this one stand out besides those Mode 7 graphics is that this is NCAA Basketball instead of the NBA, which was pretty rare to see represented back then. I mean, hell, it kinda is still. So if you're looking for a decent basketball game on the Super NES, I'd say check it out. It's really easy to jump in and just get the hang of with its arcade gameplay, and it does look pretty cool. If that sounds like a good time to you, then NCAA Basketball may be worth a look. RC Pro-Am for the NES was a game that I never asked for, but I'm kinda glad I got it. This one was from the same relative that randomly gave me Ghostbusters, so I wasn't expecting much when she pulled out another NES game one random morning and handed it to me. I wasn't much into racing games at the time, so I was expecting this one to join the pile with Jaws and Ghostbusters pretty soon. Much to my surprise though, RC Pro-Am actually ended up being one of my all-time favorite NES games. This definitely wasn't your typical racing game. First off, you're actually racing RC cars around the tracks, which I thought was really neat since I just happened to be way into RC cars back then. Also, the action's from this overhead view that really put me off at first, since most racing games I'd played at the arcade was from behind the car views. But this ended up being perfect to frame all the crazy action going on around you, since each RC car was constantly firing off missiles and bombs, all while trying to avoid the various obstacles placed around the track. Combine that with some super slidey physics, and every race turns into a complete mess of cars just sliding and shooting all over the place while jockeying for position. This is one of those games where you can go from last to first in the blink of an eye, and that's just what makes each race so unpredictable. I had so much fun with this one as a kid, and I still do to this day. The fast and addictive arcade gameplay is timeless to me. It's one of those games you can sit down with and rattle off a dozen races in no time due to just how fast and fun it is. And unlike games like Jaws and Ghostbusters, this is a random game that I'm totally happy that I ended up with. I wish they were all as fun as RC Pro-Am is. Zombies Ate My Neighbors for the Sega Genesis is not the version of the game that I wanted as a kid. Now, I mentioned this one in a previous video, but basically a clueless aunt that didn't know the difference between a Super NES and a Genesis got the wrong version of this one for me as a kid on Christmas, and I was very disappointed at the time. But really though, coming around to it, the Genesis version isn't that bad. I just had my heart set on the Super NES version. Now, I've already spoken about that Super NES version extensively on this channel, and things are basically the same here on the Genesis. Pick from two of the most early 90s looking characters you've ever seen with Zeke and Julie, and then run around stages to rescue your neighbors from various monsters from all of your favorite bad horror movies. Each level has a set number of neighbors to rescue, with the goal being to save as many as possible before those monsters get to them. It's simple, it's fun, and it's just as much fun here on the Genesis as it is the Super NES. The only thing that I really don't like about the Genesis version is that it cuts off the entire side of the screen for the map and items. And also, the music is just nowhere near as good as the Super NES. And the music's like one of the things that I really like about the game. But I still ended up playing this one a lot though. It's perfectly playable, and it actually looks really good. But if you want to play Zombies Ate My Neighbors these days, I'd still recommend that Super NES version over the Genesis. But you really can't go wrong either way with this one. It's a classic game on any system. And that's gonna do it. Did you guys have any of these games as a kid, either bought or just given to you as a gift? Well, let me know below, because I love to see what you all had to deal with too. I never had a ton as a kid, and like I said, good or bad, these games will always live rent-free in my brain for just how much I actually played them. And I guess that's gotta say something. But I think that's going to do it for me this week. If this video didn't cause you any immediate intestinal discomfort, then do me a favor and give it a like, or even a sub if you'd like to see more of these. And speaking of that, I'll be back next time with a bunch more games to talk about, and until then, thanks for watching.